Right, Ms. Graham.
Can we turn to the spreadsheet?
Yep.
On page 5. Or actually, let's start with page 4. I think just before lunch, you mentioned that you'd become aware that an emergency button had been pressed, and you'll see at 7:21:19, Ashley Tomlinson's emergency button status was turned on. Did you see that?
Yes.
And then you also mentioned hearing that the officer had been injured but didn't have serious injuries.
I believe so. There was an update prior to my arrival.
Absolutely. Let's have a look at page 5, at the very top of page 5. And we've heard that at 7:21:38, PC Smith said, an officer's been punched to the back of the head, no obvious serious injuries. Male secure on the ground. And is that the reference to the airwaves transmission that you're thinking?
Yeah, I believe so.
Thank you. And then I'd like you to look at page 6, please. And I'm going to play... oh, sorry, I should have actually asked you something else about page 5. Could you just go back a second? Sorry about that. And I think in your statement, you also mentioned that you said over the airwaves that you were going to give an update. And do we see that as 7:21:55? Stephen K requests, P.S. Maxwell, can you arrive there and give me an update, please? And then very shortly after that, 7:22:04, you say, we're just approaching, I'll give you an update.
Yes, that's correct.
So you effectively reply to Stephen K to say that you'll give him the update. And you're on your way at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And then can we look again, sorry, page 6. And I'm going to I'll show you a part of the evidence video timeline. So that's the footage on the screen, just to let you see. You'll see the real-time clock in the top left-hand corner. And then at the bottom, there's the CCTV from Gallagher's pub.
Yep.
And you can see the emergency status buttons on the left.
Mm-hmm.
If they're lit up, Peyton and Tomlinson's are lit up at this time. And then in the middle, at the top of the screen, you'll see a reconstruction tile, which is a 3D reconstruction bird's eye view of the vehicles and things arriving at the scene. So what I'm going to do is ask that we play from 7:23:10. And if you look at the spreadsheet on page 6 for 7:23:10, you'll see that in the description, slightly to the right of halfway on the spreadsheet, you'll see 2 light-coloured small vehicles appear approaching the roundabout, one from the south and one from the north, both on Henry Road. The vehicle approaching from the south turns right at the roundabout into Hayfield Road and then stops just past the exit of the roundabout. And I'm going to play that footage with Miss Wildgoose assistance and then I'm going to ask you some questions about it. So let's just watch that for a few seconds, please.
We've got one fax message here on their form, show control button.
Well, the nails on the ground at the moment. We've got several officers have taken a big restraint.
Right. So, did you see that vehicle arriving, or do you want to see that footage again?
I didn't see a vehicle.
You didn't see it, right? Let's go back to 7:23:10.
Oh, yeah.
Or just slightly beforehand, and all right, and we'll play that.
We've got one fax message here on their form, show control button.
Well, the nails on the ground at the moment.
And we'll just pause it there. So, sorry, I maybe didn't have it rewound far enough to see it. Did you see the vehicle coming up Henry Road from the right-hand side of the screen?
Yep.
Turning right into Hayfield Road, round the roundabout, and stopping on the left. We can see it behind the tree that is in front of us. And there was movement of people exiting the vehicle. Did you recognise the car?
Yeah, that's our CID vehicle.
Is that the Vauxhall Corsa with the
Yeah.
marked police on the front?
Yes, that's
you said
correct.
earlier. And DC Connell was driving,
Yes.
and you were in the front passenger seat?
Yes.
And that's you arriving at Hayfield Road. You're the sixth, we've heard evidence you're the sixth car arriving at the scene. So that was prior to your arrival.
Yep.
We've heard evidence that Walker and Payton arrived in a transit van.
Yep.
Tomlinson and Short arrived in what was known as the fish van.
Yep.
Don't know if you knew that. Smith and Good arrived in something akin to the transit van.
Mm-hmm.
Gibson and McDonough arrived in the diary car.
Yep.
And Maxwell had also arrived in a Corsa.
Yep.
So we've heard part of the airwaves transmission that you made after your arrival, and I'd like to listen to that again. So that is you see it on the spreadsheet, 7:23:13 on page 6. And we've heard snippets of that already, and I think we'd like to play that in full again. Thanks.
Blood, the nails on the ground at the moment. We've got several officers have taken a big restraint. We'll get back to you. However, we're going to need more control with leg restraint, etc. But down on the ground, so there's no risk at the moment.
Thanks very
Yes,
much.
yes.
That's lovely. Were you able to hear that? That's
Yes.
your voice.
Yes.
So, how long after you got out the car did you make that transmission?
I believe immediately.
Mm-hmm.
I did have a short conversation with Craig Walker, so it could have been after that, but I believe it was immediate as I came out and made observations.
Right. So, looking again, the police vehicle arrives between 7:23:02 and 7:23:10, according to the spreadsheet. And then this message is 7:23:13. So within seconds
Within
anyway.
seconds, yeah. So it would immediately when I got out of the car, that would make sense.
Would that make more sense to you than having stopped for a conversation with someone?
Yeah.
And did you immediately go over to the area of the restraint in
Yes.
Hayfield Road?
Yes.
And you have described, you've made this transmission. Where were you standing when you made that transmission?
Between my vehicle and the restraint, an area around there.
So you've parked on the north side of Hayfield Road and the restraint
Mhm.
we've heard was on the south.
Mm-hmm.
So a reasonably short distance between. And during the time you're making this transmission, are you on the move to get closer to the restraint, or were you standing still?
I'd likely be walking towards them. That would make sense, but I'm not. I don't know for sure.
Okay. You've said there that the mail's on the ground when you arrive,
Mm-hmm.
and several officers have taken a big restraint. What did you mean by that?
In terms of resourcing, I think
Sorry?
resourcing.
Resourcing.
In terms of how many officers were there, it was a big number essentially.
How many do you remember?
I believe in my statement, if I'm able to refer back, I knew
Yes,
I could
please
name
do.
4 officers, but I believe there was others that I couldn't name but were present. So
Right. So more than 4 officers
Yep.
present. And when you say they've taken a big restraint, can you help me understand whether you meant the restraint was ongoing or whether it had stopped?
no, the restraint was ongoing.
And when you say we're going to need more control with leg restraints, what did you mean by that?
I could hear them discussing that, and I believe I kind of observed that they were in the process of doing or starting to do that.
So what position was Mr. Bio in?
He was in the prone position, lying down.
And was he struggling at that time?
I believe my recollection at the time, and in my statements, I've said that his legs were moving. I couldn't tell you now exactly the movement of, but certainly his legs were moving.
So you arrive before they've actually applied the leg restraints, although it's being discussed,
Yes.
and his legs are still moving at that
Yes.
stage. So you were there when the leg restraints were applied?
No.
No. You'd moved away by that stage?
Yes.
All right, thank you. At that time when you first arrived, did you have any concerns at that time as to the manner of restraint or the number of officers that were involved in the restraint?
I had no concerns. For the short observations that I took at Locus, at that restraint area, I had no concerns.
And if you had had concerns, what would you have done at that time?
I would have voiced them concerns and interjected.
And can you tell me at any stage at that stage when you arrived and you saw the restraint and the officers and what was happening, did you consider at that time that it would be important to get the person from the ground upright because they were in the prone position?
I didn't consider it at that time. If you go by the kind of timing of driving to Locus, the calls coming in, I knew that due to radio messages that they had not long come to be in that position in terms of the timeline that I was aware of. So I knew that they were still gaining control. They had still to, assert that control by cuffs, etc. And then the movement would happen thereafter. I had no concerns because I didn't believe it was a vast amount of time that he'd been in the prone position.
So when you arrived, the officers were still trying to gain control?
Yes.
Mr. Bile was prone, but still his legs were still moving?
That's correct.
No handcuffs were on and no leg restraints?
Not that I observed, no.
Thank you. So no concerns for you at that particular
No.
time when you arrived? Now, can you help the chair understand when you arrived? You've told us about Mr. Bio's position. Can you tell us about the officers who were there and the positions they were in?
Can I refer to him?
And you might want to have a look at paragraph 8 of your inquiry statement, and we can get that on the screen. And I'll just read part of this out. So you arrive at 7:20, you say, turn right into Hayfield Road from Henry Road. DCI Connell parked the vehicle on the left-hand side. I believe there was a uniformed car on the same side of the road in front of our vehicle. We've heard mention that was the fish van.
Yep.
Immediately to the right of the CID vehicle was the officers and a man that I did not know but we later identified to be Mr. Bio. The majority of his body was on the pavement, head and body and upper legs. He was face down. His lower legs were stretched out into the road and his head was on the pavement and pointing in the direction of the hedge. We've heard that his head was pointing in the direction of Gallagher's pub. Is that a similar
I believe so, yeah.
description to what you
Yeah.
give there?
Yeah.
His legs were moving at this point, but I couldn't tell you exactly what the exact movement was. I don't have any recollection of how the legs were moving, for example, whether it was side to side or up and down, but certainly I do recall movement. I also observed 4 officers in particular at this point: PC Craig Walker, PC Alan Payton, PC Ashley Tomlinson and PC Daniel Gibson. PC Alan Payton being on the deceased right hand side, PC Craig Walker being on his left hand side at his upper shoulder area. PC Walker was on his upper shoulder area. PC Walker was lying on his right hand side facing away from Shepherd Bio. PC Walker was restraining him by leaning his weight on Mr. Bio's shoulder and arm. I'm clear that PC Walker was not leaning his weight on Mr. Bio's body at that time. So I'd quite like to, and then you go on in paragraph 9, you don't recall exactly what PC Payton was doing. Ashley Thompson was at his feet, and likewise so was Daniel Gibson. What they were effectively doing, I don't know. My concentration was on speaking with Craig Walker. From my statement, I can see that I remembered somebody saying leg restraints. I believed somebody was going to put leg fast straps on Mr. Bio's legs. I don't recall seeing this happen. So I'd quite like to go through that and ask you some further questions if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem.
We've obviously read that description of what PC Walker was doing, but I wonder if you could help the chair understand what you saw when you arrived, walking over the road from your vehicle towards the restraint. So you've told us about Mr. Bio prone, face towards the hedge, and tell us about where PC Walker was and what he was doing.
So PC Walker was on the left side, so the side furthest away from
Yeah.
the hayfield, the roundabout,
The roundabout.
Gallagher's. So he was on the left side, and he was lying on his side. So PC Walker was lying on his right side.
On his own side?
Yes, on the ground, and in a restraint holding Mr. Bayou's kind of top of his arm and his shoulder and his arm down.
Can I just be clear? You've said PC Walker was on the left side of Mr. Bayou. Mr. Bayou's prone, but he was lying on his right side. Was he faced away from?
Yes, he had his back to Mr. Bayou and he was facing towards the hospital.
All right. So he had his back to Mr. Bayou at that time that you arrived.
Yes.
Sitting on his right side,
Lying
on his right side, facing the direction of Hayfield Road that leads to the hospital, Victoria Hospital.
Yes.
What was he doing?
He was under restraint. He was doing a ground pin at that point.
And you've mentioned Mr. Bayou's arm. Tell us what he was doing to Mr. Bayou's arm. You've
So
talked about a
he was-
ground pin.
He was holding it down and he was looking away. So Mr. Bayou's behind him and he's pinning the top of his arm and looking the other direction.
Okay. And when you say he was he lying parallel to Mr. Bayou's body as he was lying
Certainly
on
the
the ground?
top of his body was parallel. I couldn't tell you where his legs were, but certainly the top end of his body.
But he'd pinned Mr. Bayou's left arm.
Yeah.
What about PC Peyton? Where was he?
He was on the right side, but, you know, as I said in a couple of statements now, I can't exactly say what he was doing in terms of restraint, where his hands were, because my focus was, asked Craig Walker a couple of questions, he answered them, and then I left. So in terms of what Alan Payton was doing exactly, I don't know. And likewise for Daniel Gibson and Ashley Tomlinson, I knew they were at the feet of Mr. Bayou, but exactly what they were doing, I don't know.
As you approached the area of the restraint,
Yeah.
where were those two officers? One was one on the left and one on the right in
I
the
believe
feet
I
area?
have said that, yeah. That I think it's in my perk statement. I don't know if
Okay, let's have a look at your
on the
first statement from the 4th of May, which is
The 2nd of
PS
June.
00379. And that was your first self-pen statement. And then we've also got PERC 184, which is your statement of the 29th of May.
185. It's in.
It's 185, right. Look at that. So this is the statement of the 2nd of June 2015. Is this page 4
Yes.
by any chance? Let's have a look at page 4. And we'll see at paragraph 5, let's start with that. It starts, I saw 4 officers in particular. And we can see that on the screen. As I got out of the passenger side of the car, these officers were Walker, Peyton, Tomlinson, Gibson. PC Peyton was on the deceased's right-hand side, controlling the deceased, but I don't know how. PC Walker was lying on the deceased's left side, his upper shoulder area. He was lying effectively on his right-hand side, facing away from the deceased. I cannot remember if the deceased said anything. I do not remember if his face was on the left or the right. It was not face down. And then you say PC Ashley Tomlinson was at the male's feet on the male's left side. So Tomlinson was on Mr. Bayou's left side. Is that correct?
Yeah.
PC Daniel Gibson was also at the feet of the deceased's right side at the feet. So he was on Mr. Bayou's right-hand side.
At the bottom of
his
his
legs.
feet, yeah.
I think Ashley Thompson was holding his lower legs, but his legs were moving. I cannot recall what PC Gibson was doing. I remember somebody saying leg restraints. I believed somebody was going to put leg restraining straps on his legs. I do not recall seeing them being put on the deceased Bayou. And you've said earlier, you asked a couple of questions of PC Walker when you arrived. What were you asking?
I asked him where PC Nicole Short was, because she wasn't visible to me. And I asked him where the vehicle keys were for the transit van.
Right. And what information did you receive about both those things?
They're both in the van. So Nicole Short was in the van as well as the keys were in the van.
Right. And that was PC Walker's van, the transit van?
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you if we could look at paragraph 11 of your inquiry statement? You see, I asked Craig what was taking place and where Nicole was, as I was aware she was injured. He said to me he is struggling, referring to Mr. Bio, and told me Nicole was in the van. I asked him where the van keys were, as I intended to drive the van closer to the officers, as I knew this male was being arrested. The officers would require the police van to convey a custody, and this was the only van on scene. Craig said that the keys were in the vehicle, so I made my way towards the van. I was with PC Craig Walker and the other officers for a minute or 2 minutes at most. I see from my statement that I've checked up on control to give them an update that the male was restrained and officers had control of him. So at this stage, the restraint's ongoing.
Yep.
You know they're going to be applying leg restraints. And you take the view you need the custody van because he was going to be taken into custody. That's he being Mr. Bio.
Yes.
And you then went to get the transit van that Walker and Payton had arrived in.
Yeah, my focus was that time was Nicole, not the van.
Oh,
but
right.
that was a secondary.
So the Nicole Short, the officer who'd been injured, was the priority at that time.
Yes.
And when you went over to the van, tell me how she appeared to you.
So I approached the van and I climbed in the driver's side of the van. She was sitting within the passenger area of the front of the transit van. I think I've detailed in my statement she was visibly crying, shaking, holding at her head, and, looked like she was in total shock, essentially.
We've heard evidence that she was very distressed in the
Yes.
van, and that seems to have been
Yep.
your recollection. And you said she was holding her head. Do you remember where in her head she was holding?
She just kept on gripping the back of her head, like pulling at her hair and holding the back of her head.
Right. And did she say anything about her head?
I believe she said to me that she'd been struck by him, and I assumed she meant Mr. Bayou.
Did she say where she'd been struck?
I don't know if I have that recorded. I'm sure she said in the head, but
If we look at your perk statement, page 6, the one we just looked at a moment ago, 185. And I'm thinking paragraph 6 on this page. It starts, when I first saw her, she was crying. There we are. There were tears running down her face. Her hands were shaking. Her hands were trembling. She was visibly shaking and in shock. She's very small and of slight build. I think she has only 5 years police service. I queried the injuries she had to her. She said that the back of her head was sore. She'd been struck to the back of the head and she did not say how. She said he did it. I took it this was Shikubayo she referred to. She said something similar to he was going to jump on her head, and if it was not for Craig, meaning PC Walker, and then she broke down more. When I made a reference in my earlier statement to other officers present protected her, I believe she meant PC Craig Walker. Thank you. And that's what you told PERC on the 2nd of June 2015.
yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Was there anything obvious about her head, or did you notice any obvious injury?
No, so I got out the van and went round to the passenger side. I comforted her and took her from the van onto the kind of pavement or the road, and I tried to have a look at her head. As you're aware, you've met Nicole, her hair's particularly thick, and I couldn't actually get a proper look, but what I ascertained was there was no bleeding injury. And it was at that point DI Colin Robson turned up and we made the decision that we weren't waiting on an ambulance. We were just going to take her because she was walking wounded.
And did he then make arrangements to have her taken to the hospital, or did you make those arrangements?
No, he pulled up behind the van in his vehicle, so I approached the vehicle and just says, look, we could see the hospital from where it was like 200 yards away, so I put her into the passenger side of the vehicle, and DI Colin Robson took her to the hospital, a short journey.
And that was a quicker approach than actually waiting for the ambulance.
Yeah, she was safe enough to be travelled in a police car as opposed to
Yeah.
an ambulance.
And then at paragraph 15 of your inquiry statement, if we can go back to that, you were asked if you remember any mention being made of her being stamped on. At that point, I was not aware of any reference to Nicole being stood on or stamped on from Nicole, or even transmissions on the radio. I don't think. Certainly, I didn't overhear that Nicole had been stamped on. It wasn't until later in the media scenario that I've seen that in that moment in time, I didn't ask and it was never said to me. I didn't see any marks on Nicole's uniform, but again, I wasn't paying particular attention, but certainly there was nothing obvious. And that remains your position today.
Yes.
Thank you. And then you've told us that you, how long did you spend with Nicole Short? Did I ask that?
A few minutes at most.
Right. And then you have told us you drove the transit closer to where the restraint was going on.
That was correct, yeah.
So D.I. Robson arrived and you arranged that he would take her to the hospital, Nicole Short.
Mm-hmm.
And then did you get the keys to the transit van and move it at that point?
Yes.
And can I ask you to look at some still images too, number 4 in the still images? Actually, I think I'd rather have... Sorry, it was actually number 6 that I was interested in. Right. So this is an image, a 3D image of various vehicles at the scene at a later moment in time. Can you, just for the purposes of clarity, can you identify your vehicle from this image?
Yes, the small grey one.
And the transit van that you moved that had Nicole Short in it? And for both of those vehicles, are you reasonably content that these are a reasonable indication of where the position in the road at Hayfield Road
Yes, reasonable,
that
yeah.
they were in? Thank you. So 2 was the transit van that had been taken from the bus stop area,
Mm-hmm.
and then was moved to nearer the island on Hayfield Road that we see on the image.
Yep.
And the restraint that you returned to was going on where?
In this area here, I believe.
Thank you. That's lovely. That's number 3. Now, can I ask you, prior to leaving the area of the restraint and going to speak to Nicole Short, had anyone at that time been monitoring Mr. Byles' breathing as far as you were aware?
I was not aware of that.
All right, thank you. Can we look at the spreadsheet, please? And can we look at 72517, and this is on page 7 of the spreadsheet. Now you'll see that at this time, 72517, it's a transmission from PC Smith,
Mm-hmm.
which says, this male certainly appears to be unconscious, breathing, not responsive, get an ambulance for him. Did you remember hearing that transmission?
I recall hearing a transmission that he was unresponsive. I couldn't tell you if it was from PC Alan Smith or the full context, but
No.
I do remember knowing that he was unresponsive.
So you realised that he'd become unresponsive.
Mhm.
Where were you when you heard that
I
transmission?
believe I was driving the van back towards the restraint area.
So you were in the transit van, moving it to the position you just demonstrated on the image, when you realised that he'd become unresponsive. What did you do after you stopped the van? What did you do immediately after that?
I'm slightly confused what came first, but essentially I know I approached the restraint and observed Mr. Bayou for myself. I felt for a pulse. I couldn't feel an external pulse, so I asked PC Alan Smith to corroborate that because I wasn't sure that that was correct, and he did so, and then CPR commenced.
Right. Let's look at PS 379 again before I ask you some further questions. So this is your self-statement dated the 4th of May. So this is the first statement that we have in the bundle.
Mhm.
And can we look at page 3? Sorry, page 4, I should have said. And at the very top of the page, it says, at this point I myself checked the deceased for a pulse, right side of his neck, could not feel a pulse. I asked PC Alan Smith to confirm or locate a pulse. I believe PC Smith could not feel a pulse as soon thereafter the officers relayed the deceased had no cardiac output and CPR commenced. I mainly observed PC Walker carry out chest compressions. An ambulance was requested to attend immediately, and the current position of the deceased was transmitted on the radio. So you yourself checked by pressing the right side of his neck without success in finding a pulse. You got PC Alan Smith to do something similar. Did he touch the same area or did he touch a different area?
I believe he did the exact same movement I did.
Same thing. And he couldn't feel a pulse. And then you've said the officers relayed the deceased had no cardiac output and CPR commenced. Does that mean there was a message transmitted?
I believe so, yep.
Yeah. And do we see, in fact, at 7, on page 7 of the spreadsheet, 7:25:17 from PC Smith, Males now certainly appears to be unconscious, breathing, not responsive, get an ambulance for him.
I don't believe that would be the
That was the first
That's the
message.
unresponsive
And
message.
then there's a message later on page 11 of the spreadsheet at the top. And this is 7:29:30 from Scott Maxwell. Control, can you get a move on with the ambulance? This accused is now not breathing. CPR is commencing, over. Is that the message that you
I believe so. yeah.
remember?
That's familiar.
So the first message, when he was unconscious but breathing, where were you?
I was still driving the van back.
You're
so
driving
I was
the
aware,
van back.
but I wasn't at the restraint.
You weren't there at that time.
Yeah.
But when the second message is made by Scott Maxwell, that he's not breathing and CPR is commencing, were you at the restraint
Yes.
at that point?
Yes.
So you'd returned to the restraint
Yes.
from then. The van had been moved by that point.
Yes.
Thank you. From the point you were at the restraint at that stage, did you see PC Smith do a test to see if he could get a pain response from Mr. Bayou?
I believe I have said in statements that I heard him trying to get a verbal response.
What do you mean by that?
I believe he was just asking him, are you, can you hear me type scenario, are you okay? I don't remember any kind of pain response It could have happened. It's something I didn't observe.
Do you remember at all seeing PC Payton slapping or tapping or patting Mr. Bio on the face?
No.
At that time, was there anyone monitoring his breathing?
I don't have any recollection of that because when I arrived, I've pretty much immediately felt for the pulse and it was CPR, so I don't know if that was maybe pre my arrival, but I didn't observe any of that.
All right, thank you. In relation to how the officers in the area were, can you tell us how many officers were around at that time and where were they? So,
I knew all 8 officers from Team 4 were on scene. Exactly where they were, I don't know. Scott Maxwell was in the area of the restraint also. I was aware of him in my periphery. PC Craig Walker was again remaining on the left side of Mr. Bayou. Alan Payton was in around the kind of head or area on the pavement, and I knew Alan Smith was down to my right. He was directly next to me on the right. Where the other officers were positioned, I suspect nearby, but I don't know.
what was PC Walker doing at the time?
He was just kneeling down to Mr. Bowes' side.
What was PC Payton doing? Do you remember?
Likewise, he was just kneeling down on the pavement, but exactly, I don't know.
Do you know what PC Smith was doing?
When I arrived, he was kneeling down, and as I said, he was trying to get a verbal response. I recall that, and then I went over, felt for the pulse. He's done similar, and then CPR's commenced.
And which officers commenced the CPR?
PC Craig Walker.
And we've heard that sometimes work in teams of 2.
Yes.
Who was his partner?
I suspect Alan Smith took over, but I didn't observe that.
Did you observe the CPR?
Yes.
By the time CPR was being performed, was Mr. Bio in handcuffs?
Yes.
Was he in leg restraints?
I never ever observed leg restraints.
Oh,
But it's purely, they would have been in position, but I do not have a recollection of physically seeing them.
Can I ask you, by the time you've arrived, you're a sergeant in
Yes.
CID. We've heard about Maxwell was an acting police sergeant.
Yes.
When you arrived at the scene, in terms of your rank and seniority, were you in charge at that point?
No, we were, I wouldn't be in charge initially. That is a response call, and we are attending not an investigative matter, we're intending to back up as a police officer. So I wouldn't take charge of PS Maxwell's team
Right.
or the situation. So we can work together, that's not an issue at all. We can work together, I'll help him out, he can help me out. But certainly I was going as a support officer for the response.
So you're not coming onto the scene and taking command or
No.
taking charge of that?
No. Unless I see I need to do so, I wouldn't do that.
But if you saw the need for you to do that,
Yes.
how would you communicate that to the officer who was in charge?
I would essentially discuss it constructively and pass my guidance on.
Okay. But that conversation did not happen
No.
on this occasion?
No.
So as far as you're concerned, who was in charge of this incident?
P.S. Scott Maxwell was there in charge of the incident initially, and he was in charge of his officers. However, I'd be happy to share that responsibility. I was on scene also, and I was a sergeant.
Okay. Right. So during the CPR, when you're in the area
Yep.
and you see that proceeding
Yep.
and you think it was commenced by PC Walker,
Yes.
at any time did you consider instructing or requesting that his handcuffs be removed?
No, I didn't consider instructing that. My sole focus was on Mr. Bayou, his upper body, looking at his face, looking at the CPR. If I'm being honest, I didn't even look at the cuffs. The urgency was life-saving kind of intervention, so I didn't look at the cuffs. I didn't consider taking them off.
And are you first aid trained?
Yes.
You can perform that type of CPR?
Yes.
Was there anything about the CPR at that time that caused you to have any concerns about its effectiveness or the way it was being performed?
No, I observed Craig Walker completing the CPR. As far as I'm aware, it was very effective, and then there was no restriction to the chest area that I observed.
We've heard that Mr. Bio had his hands cuffed together at the front.
Yes.
And that position can compress the chest
Mm-hmm.
and could interfere with effective CPR.
Yep.
I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but
Yeah, yeah.
that we've heard evidence about that. And was there anything that drew your attention or caused you to have concern about the position of the handcuffs, or the fact that he was to the front?
My observation of CPR gave me no concern. It was effective and it was ongoing. I had no concern, and I was not drawn to the cuffs causing any issue. As I say, and honestly, I didn't even look at the cuffs. My focus was on Mr. Bayou and the CPR and the concern for him.
Right. Now, you've told us when you first arrived, Mr. Bayou was prone. You've told us about CPR.
Yeah.
When CPR was being performed, was he on his back?
Yes.
Were you present when he moved from his front to his back?
No.
Did you see at any time how he was moved from his front to his back?
When I first arrived, he was on his left side. When I came back with the van, he was on his left side. I didn't know who moved him from his back to his left side, and then obviously Alan Smith and Craig Walker took part in moving him to his back to perform CPR.
So when you returned from moving the transit van,
Yes.
he was on his left-hand side by that time?
Yes.
And then you witnessed him being moved onto his back to start the CPR?
Yes.
Thank you. Did you see PC Smith bringing a mask to try and provide rescue breaths?
No, I
Mr.
don't.
Bayou?
I didn't observe that. So I've obviously left PS Maxwell, the officers, with Mr. Bayou doing CPR and gone off to do other matters.
Thank you. Did you see Mr. Bayou being stretchered into the ambulance later?
I did.
So you were back by that
Yes,
stage?
I was in that vicinity at all times, but yeah.
Can I ask you then about paragraph 19 of your inquiry statement, please? And you say Derek Connell was to my right-hand side as you face Henry Road. Not far away, just across the road, he shouted out that he had recovered a knife. Whether he did that as I approached the officers and Mr. Bio, or whether this was after I checked for a pulse, I can't remember. The order of that is a bit jumbled and I can't be 100% sure. But it probably happened pretty much all at the same time, because we were only a short distance away from each other and things were happening simultaneously. Somebody was shouting on this side and I was helping out this side. So it's probably all consecutively happening about the same time. I'm interested in this knife.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me about DC Connell's involvement with that?
Obviously, when I arrived back with the van after Nicole Short had gone to the hospital, Mr. Bayou's unresponsive, but obviously Derek's over to my right, which would be the north side of Hayfield Road, the grass area on the corner, and he shouts that he has located the knife. By this point, he's already collected the knife from its original position from the grass and walking towards our vehicle. So I have gone to the boot of our vehicle. There's not enough big enough knife tube that we had within the boot, so I grabbed a brown evidence bag. We put it within the bag and then secured it and locked our vehicle and secured it within the vehicle.
Could I ask you to look at something for me, please? And I'm just going to... It's in a plastic tube, and I'm just going to ask you if you recognise this.
Yes.
And what is that?
That is the knife.
That's the knife that you've just described to us,
Yes,
that DC Connell recovered. And actually you'll see a photograph on the screen which shows the knife. And that's the knife that was recovered from Hayfield Road in the grassy area.
Yeah, my signature is on that.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. And then can I ask you just to confirm something? 731 13, which you will see at the bottom of page 11. And we've heard some evidence at this stage that there had been a request initially for a dog unit to attend, and during the course of the events on the 3rd of May that a Gary Wood from the dog unit had been in touch, and then you were involved to say Gary Wood at 7:31:02 said, "That's great, thank you. Was there any talk? I didn't hear the entirety of the job initially came in. Is there anything else that's outstanding that you may require a dog for?" And you made the transmission at 7:31:13 and said no, negative. So it was you that told the dog unit, Gary Wood, not that it wasn't any longer required.
I believe so. I have no recollection of that, but yeah, it's recorded, obviously.
Thank you. And paragraph 21 of your inquiry statement, please, if we can have that on the screen. And at the point of Mr. Bile becoming unresponsive and in cardiac arrest, this is the point at which CPR was commenced. The situation changed to a far more serious incident and something that CID would lead on.
Yeah.
So it was at that point that the transition is that I'm going to start taking control of this incident. It's no longer a uniformed response incident. I collected barrier tape from one of the police vehicles. I'm not sure which one. We're all in all the vehicles, so it would have been whatever vehicle was nearby to me. I then set parameters for the locust protection, which was at the junction of Hayfield Road with Henry Road, and also Hayfield Road with Poplar Road. As I was setting the barrier tape on Poplar Road, that's when the ambulance has arrived. I allowed them in and then set the cordon again, and I put officers on locust protection, which was PC Cayley Good at the Hayfield Road Henry Road junction, and PC McDonough at the Hayfield Road Poplar Road junction, with instructions not to allow anybody to enter unless they have permission to do so. If we can go back to the top of that, I'll ask you some questions. So I asked you a few moments ago about who was in charge, and you explained your understanding of the position initially.
Mm-hmm.
But you said in paragraph 21 that when Mr. Bile became unresponsive in cardiac arrest and CPR was commenced,
Mm-hmm.
that you realised this was a far more serious incident.
Yep.
So was this the point at which things changed in terms of command and who was in charge?
Yeah, I instinctively took charge at that point, knowing the kind of gravity of the situation,
Right.
and obviously started completing some priority actions and containing the scene, etc.
Right. So because you were on the scene at that time, you were able to take that decision
Yep.
as soon as that happened.
Yep.
And when you talk about taking priority decisions, can you maybe explain to us what priority decisions were taken by you?
So the initial one was scene management in terms of setting parameters and securing the area. In terms of any further contamination of the area, I would be resourcing persons within the ambulance and also at the hospital. And then we would then follow on to, contacting initial witnesses, etc., gathering information to develop the situation.
So that then becomes a serious investigation that there will need witnesses and such like.
Yes.
And so in terms of you taking control, is that something that you shared with Acting Police Sergeant Maxwell, or was that something that you just naturally or instinctively took control?
No, time was not on our side. Essentially, I instinctively done that. PS Scott Maxwell did not object to it. We didn't have a big discussion about it. It was just something that happened and he went along with.
And would it have been reasonably obvious to Maxwell or other officers that you were now in more of a control, taking control or being more proactive.
Yes, he was still in control of his own officers. I didn't take full control from him, but I was controlling and containing the scene and the incident.
Right. So by the time we looked at that message that you made a couple of messages on page 11 of the spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
So we see the entry at 7:29:30 towards the top of the page. Scott Maxwell, get a move on with the ambulance. This accused is now not breathing. CPR is commencing, over. So how long after that call would you say you took command? We see the entry 7:29:51, where you say, that's me now taping this area off. Did you hear the last? Was it really from that point that you were in charge?
Yeah, in and around that point.
In and around. And when you say taping the area off, is that we've seen some footage with officers taping off one end of Hayfield Road at the roundabout end. Is that the sort of exercise that was being carried out by officers?
Yeah, I would tell them exactly where I want it taped. It's like the police barrier tape, essentially, and you just cordon that area and guard it.
Thanks. And as one of the actions that you take when you're in taking control of what's become a serious incident, do you also prepare a scene log?
You don't prepare one. They're within the vehicle. They're blank documents,
Right.
Or blank books.
Can we look at paragraph 22, please? I'm asked about what the usual practice would have been regarding having a scene log. The scene log would generally start as soon as practical if you have them to hand, given the situation. We have them in vehicles, they can be produced fairly quickly, and if not, we could collect them from the nearest police station. So really, as soon as an incident becomes more serious and you're in charge, these are the sorts of documentation that you want.
Yeah, the
to
scene
have
log
at
is
hand.
essentially there to log anybody coming to and from
Right.
entry from the scene. So it's essentially persons, scenes of crime, photographers, etc.
Anyone entering
Yeah.
into your secure
Cordon,
area
yeah.
or leaving the secure area,
Yeah.
and the timings of
The
those
timings
things.
and rationale for visit and permission.
And the purpose of that is to have a record
Mhm.
of everyone entering or leaving the scene.
Yes.
Thanks. And then paragraph 23, you say, I told DC Connell to accompany Mr. Bile to the hospital. I see from my statement that D.I. Robson was back at the scene by that time. You told us earlier he'd gone to take Nicole Short to the hospital. And we had a discussion about the cordons. What are the cordons?
That is the police barrier tape.
Right. And then you say a discussion also took place between PIK, Sergeant Maxwell and me regarding replacing the officers at the scene, that the officers involved should return to the Kirkcaldy Police Office and go to the canteen. So do we see that Inspector K had arrived by this time?
Yes.
Do you remember when he arrived?
He gave me a point-to-point. I think he was initially on Victoria Road. There was a confusion initially with a few of the calls, and he had gone to Victoria Road point-to-point, and I told him to come up to Hayfield Road. I think that was after Mr. Bayou went into cardiac arrest. I don't think it was before then.
No. So after he's gone into cardiac arrest, after the ambulance has been called?
Possibly, I don't know.
Yeah. But before the ambulance has arrived and taken him to hospital?
I'm not sure.
Not sure. And but he was there at some point
Mhm.
at the scene, and then this discussion took place, between you, Inspector K, and Sergeant Maxwell, about the officers involved returning to Kirkcaldy Police Office.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, essentially we're on scene. All the officers looked, particularly shocked, quiet. I was really worried about their welfare, actually. My initial concern was this was the full Kirkcaldy resource. What do we do to answer the calls that are still coming in? And my fear was that the controller would dispatch these officers to another call.
I see.
So I made it clear to Inspector Kay that I think we need to quickly resource Kirkcaldy with other officers so these officers would not be sent to another call. Because if an immediate 999 call came in, there was a potential that they would get pulled away and dispatched. So I knew that they weren't fit to do so. They were in shock and they needed to return and debrief back at the station.
So as part of that, you needed to resource other officers who could take control of any 999 calls that came in.
That was Inspector Kay's.
So that was, but
Yeah.
you raised that with
I
him
raised
at
that concern with him.
at that point. And then it goes on to say, at that time, PC Good and McDonough remained on scene undertaking locust protection. So did you feel at that stage that PC Good and McDonough were sufficiently well to continue with duties on locust protection?
More so than the other officers, however, I wanted to replace them as soon as I could as well, but I had no other option. It was essentially use both of them at that time. They appeared okay with it, they agreed to it, and then we quickly obviously resourced and replaced them.
Thank you. My statement notes that I recall PC Payton and Walker were running to the police van. The word running here is incorrect. PC Payton and PC Walker were directly next to the van and would have no requirement or opportunity to run. I recall observing both sitting in the van with the engine running, and they left Locust thereafter. So PC Walker and PC Payton, had they gone back to the transit van that they had arrived in
They
originally?
were now sitting within the transit van, yeah.
Walker in the driver's seat,
I believe so, yeah.
but they weren't running to the van. It was
No, I think
more
that's
the
a
engine
typo.
running.
Yeah, a typo in the perk statement which I corrected. The van was running, they weren't running.
Thank you. And paragraph 24, you went back to Kirkcaldy Police Office at 8 o'clock. You say that DC Connell was at Victoria Hospital with Sheku Bayo. So we may hear that he'd gone in the ambulance. You'd not spoken to any senior officers on your return. You mention a couple of OSP officers there at Kirkcaldy CID, and they were sent to Victoria Hospital and to remain with Mr. Bayo. And then if we can move up the page, please. And you made arrangements in relation to what was happening at the hospital at that time. And are those two officers, Basili and Brown, was it? Sorry. Are they part of your, or were they part of your team at that time?
Yeah, they commenced duty at 8 o'clock. It's a staggered start. So it was myself and Derek Connell at 7, Ryan Bosilli and Andrew Brown were starting at 8 o'clock.
Right. And then Connell returned to Kirkcaldy around 8:15. He had a gold mobile phone and a lighter, which I understand belonged to Mr. Bayo. And these items were placed in the ambulance with DC Connell. It was at this point that DC Connell explained he'd taken a photograph of the knife in situ with his mobile phone, and he had been instructed by D.I. Robson to do this. Is that the knife that you identified for me just moments ago?
Yes, it is.
So Connell, DC Connell, had actually taken a photograph at the scene of the knife before he picked it up and
Yes.
recovered it. And then paragraph 25, I'm asked about an airwave transmission at 8:18 in which I transmitted to the officers at the locus asking the officer who had taken a statement to point me. We've heard that that's a direct radio call between one officer and another. And then you require a certain number of the radio you wish to contact in order to do that. One of the officers involved in locust protection mentioned he'd been approached at the cordon. I didn't have the number to phone him. When I transmitted to request that officer to make contact, my number would have been visible and enabled him to then point me. So this is really just, you're continuing to communicate with an officer at the scene at Hayfield Road, but you're back in Kirkcaldy Police Office at this time.
I believe so, yeah.
Thank you. And can I ask you to look at some photographs now, please, for me? (03374). Am I correct in saying that it was you that added all the names to this photograph?
I don't believe it's my writing, it was the park officer's writing, but yes, I talked through it and named each officer on scene.
And we see DC Connell heading towards the grassy area at the top of the screen in the
Yes.
blue jacket.
Mhm.
And then we can see you, DS Davidson, dressed in dark clothing. But did you have your hair up that day?
Yes.
And that's you standing next to, or to the right of PC Smith. And again, looking at that picture today, do you still agree with everyone you've identified?
Yeah, I believe so.
Then can we look at the next photograph, please? And again, it may not be your writing, but again, did you identify people from this photograph?
Yes, I believe it did, yes.
So again, those are your identifications. Thank you. And you agree with those today?
Yeah.
Thank you. Before you left the scene, did you issue any instructions to officers not to confer or discuss the incident with each other?
I did not instruct them.
And is there a reason for that or not?
Just wasn't priority at the time. I didn't think about it. My concern was scene management, tasking the priority actions and the welfare of the officers. The non-conferring aspect, I didn't even consider it on scene.
Okay. And then at some stage, were you involved in identifying Mr. Bio?
Yes.
And I think you've given the chair information about that in paragraph 31 of your inquiry statement. And was that in relation to, or in comparison to, excuse me, images that you recovered from Facebook?
I didn't recover them from
No.
Facebook. I think
Sorry.
it was a family member that had recovered them.
And you used that as a comparison?
Yes.
With Mr. Bio at the hospital?
Yes.
And can I ask you, how is it normally done that you work out the identification of someone who's in hospital?
In hospital, generally, when we're in that setting, family are with the person, have probably travelled with,
But
or
if you
been
don't,
contacted.
if you don't know the person,
In a hospital setting, it depends if it's an unexplained death or an expected death.
right?
If it's an unexplained death and there's forensic aspects to it, then it'll be an SIO's decision how we go about identification. Obviously, it's very important that we complete that. On most occasions, for an unexplained death where forensic integrity is a matter, we would convey the deceased to the mortuary. There's an area, a viewing area in the mortuary where it's behind glass, so there's no physical contact at that stage. So we could do the identity with least impact to the forensic integrity. That was how I'd normally do it, would be at the mortuary setting.
And you've mentioned the SIO, that's the Senior Investigating Officer.
Yeah.
So who would that have been on the 3rd of May 2015?
Initially, obviously, on scene, it was myself was the deputy SIO, Colin Robinson was the SIO. However, that changed dynamically throughout the day because more senior officers arrived. I'm not privy to the structure of command thereafter, so that would be
Okay.
probably something that would be asked of someone else.
Okay. When you returned to Kirkcaldy Police Office, we understand the officers went back to the canteen.
Yes.
And I think you've given some information in your inquiry statement, paragraphs 63 and 64.
That doesn't go up to...
Maybe got the wrong... No,
Wrong numbers.
I don't know why I've got those numbers there. Let's forget that. Forget I said that. Terrible typo there. Did you have any involvement with speaking to the officers in the canteen about what they should be doing, providing any information, giving any statements?
No.
We may have heard some evidence that one or more officer felt that you and DC Connell were treated differently to the officers who'd been at the scene, maybe involved in the restraint. And were you aware of that at the time?
I wasn't aware of post-incident procedures. That's not something I was aware of. I don't believe that was routine for death or serious injury in custody. I believe that was something that came in later. But at that moment in time, I had no awareness of post-incident procedures or the role of a post-incident manager. I don't believe the officers would have done either. My belief was that they were in the canteen for a welfare aspect, nothing other than that.
And we may have heard some evidence, we have heard some evidence that one of the officers felt that perhaps you were getting favourable treatment because you were allowed to leave the canteen and go about your business to some extent,
Yes.
as did DC Connell, whereas they were told to remain within the canteen. And can you explain why that would have been?
No, to be fair, retrospectively, I understand that and I acknowledge that. At the time, I wasn't told to go anywhere specific. I wasn't told I was subject to any specific procedures, so I didn't. I continued my job. I had a job to do. I had other jobs to do. And I believe, I was under the belief they could have left the canteen. So, no, I didn't question it. Apologies.
No, not at all. So you just went about your normal business that day after you got back to Kirkcaldy Police Office?
Yeah, I had other matters too.
And did you complete your notebook, and you obviously completed your self-penned statement and gave a statement to PERC at an earlier date in May and then again on the 2nd of June?
Yep.
Did you have any involvement with Amanda Given?
Nope.
Can I ask you just one or two questions about race before we complete this section? Can I ask you, you're obviously an inspector.
Yes.
I've been asking officers about equality and diversity training, and many of them have spoken about training they had at Tullyallen. And it would appear that many of them have said they didn't really receive any additional equality and diversity training. Is that your experience?
My experience is obviously the initial. We had 2 weeks when we first joined. I believe I also had diversity and equality training locally in Fife in 2014, which was recorded on my scope. And recently we have had further training online, which is to do with the competency and value frameworks. Fundamentally, that brings in human rights, etc. So within that package, online package and testing, there was also aspects to do with diversity within that.
And is that training that you've had as part of your role as inspector, or is that just across Police Scotland?
No, that's across Police Scotland.
For all officers of any rank?
The competency and value framework.
Yes.
All officers should complete that.
Thank you. And part of that involves equality and diversity training?
Yes, within that. Yeah.
Was any of that training in relation to race, discrimination, bias?
It's about integrity, fairness and respect for all cultures within your community. So it doesn't go specific. It's that kind of fundamental principles, the overarching principles of values, and how you should, as a person, have them personal values as well, on or off duty. So that's the framework that we as police officers should abide by, and we should value personally and whilst as an officer.
And was any part of any of the training you've had, did any of it relate to unconscious bias or recognising unconscious bias?
I don't believe it was labelled unconscious bias, but I don't recall.
Has any of the training ever asked you to self-reflect or consider your own bias, and asked you to recognise any unconscious bias or anything like that?
Most of even my detective training, you have to be self-reflective to learn and develop and evolve. So self-reflection is something that is apparent in most training packages that we do. Certainly detective packages, senior investigating officers training, and the CVFs also, to be self-reflective.
And have you been taught any tools or skills that would allow you to guard against bias or prejudice or discrimination?
No tools, there's no specific tools to go by. It's inevitably to be open-minded, considerate, and if you're open-minded, you'll make accurate and informed decisions. If you're not open-minded and you're not taking in all accounts, then you will make inaccurate and, poor decisions, essentially. So, yeah, open-mindedness is the main factor for me anyway.
All right, thank you. When you were at Hayfield Road, were you aware at that time, so we're talking May 2015, were you aware at that time about some high-profile deaths in the UK and abroad of people, particularly black men, dying after police restraint?
I have to say, I have no recollection. I've tried, I knew, and this question had been asked before. And honestly, if I'm answering that honestly and uninfluenced, I've no recollection.
That's not something you'd been taught about or that had been raised with you in any training courses?
Possibly, but I can't recall.
So you weren't aware of any particular risks associated with restraint in the prone position? Or statistical information about...
I was aware about risks in terms of prone position, we were aware about positional asphyxia, etc. We were taught that in OST. So I was aware of prone position being a risk.
Right. When you saw Mr. Bio on the ground in Hayfield Road being restrained by officers, you've told us when you arrived he was in the prone position.
Yes.
Did you consider the risks, significant risks of that restraint when Mr. Bio was in the prone position?
I did not consider intervening or thinking there was a kind of increased risk at that point, as I've detailed that my impression was, my assessment was that he had just become to be in that position due to the timeline of events, and that once cuffs were applied, he'd be moved into a safer position. Yes, I didn't observe that movement. However, that was my assessment, and I didn't consider any risks at that point.
Did you consider at that stage calling for an ambulance straight away?
No.
No. If you could just give me a moment, please. Thank you very much.
Any Rule 9 applications, Ms. Mitchell? Detective Inspector, would you retire to the witness room, please, while I hear a submission? Yes, Ms. Mitchell, if you come to the table, please.
Yes, the first issue is in relation to the taking control of the scene, having barrier tape having been placed up. And it was simply to ask, after Sheikh Abayo's body was removed in the ambulance, did the officer notice batons lying around, and did she consider taking any action in relation to them? The next issue is in relation to the sudden death report, and we had understood from our Section 9 application that my learned friend was going to ask questions on this, and I don't think my learned friend highlighted that particular issue, so I would like to ask some of the questions that we wanted to in relation to that, namely, what was the purpose of the report? What is the content of a sudden death report? The witness indicates that she had sight of and relied upon Zaid Said and Colette Bell's statement when she wrote the document for the sudden death report, and to ask her what the relevance of those two witnesses were for that report, and whether or not she thought to seek any information from the officers that were in attendance, and if not, why not? And the death report itself states This resulted in the deceased being restrained to the ground, handcuff and leg restraints were applied. Brackets, details of officers involved are known to PERC and are not included in this report, and to ask why the details of the officers involved were not included in the death report. The next issue is in relation to something my learned friend did touch on, which was the identification and the treatment of Mr. Bayo's body. And it's to ask more questions in relation to paragraph 31 of the witness's statement. The witness did give information that this was not an orthodox way of identifying, and she gave some information of what was the orthodox way or straightforward, and she gave an explanation about urgency. And what I want to ask was what had been the delay to that point, and then ask her if she was then at 11 a.m. able to accurately confirm that it was Mr. Bayo, who she confirmed that to, and also given the fact was that the urgency was to let his family know as soon as possible, to explore the fact that despite some 4 hours passing, her Sheikh Bayo's family members, his sister and other family members had still not been informed. Lastly, the inquiry may come to you that Sheikh Bayo's sister and his brother-in-law were asked to identify Mr. Bayo later on, and they asked that if that could happen the next day when Mr. Sheikh Bayo's mother had arrived in Scotland, and to ascertain whether or not it would be orthodox to have a second identification by family members. And finally, to ask this witness whether or not she is aware of the identity of the person who contacted the Sierra Leone embassy to have Sheikh Bayo's body repatriated.
Ms. Graham, in relation to the sudden death report, is that something that the inquiry will be looking at a later stage?
Yes, I apologise to Miss Mitchell. I should have explained this to her earlier today and it slipped my mind. There is reference in the witness's inquiry statement to the sudden death report, paragraphs 34, 35 and 36. And I initially, when I was considering the Rule 9 application, I said I would be happy to ask further questions. I checked the position and it was confirmed to me this morning that the sudden death report was not cleared for disclosure to core participants, has not ever been disclosed, and it's not at a stage it's been cleared for disclosure publicly. And so it wouldn't be possible to have any of that on the screen. And in relation to the inquiry witness statement, this witness has indicated already, and this is evidence before the chair, that she created a synopsis used to assist DS Moore and DI Wilson to submit the SDR. And we will be exploring this at a later stage, but as at today's hearing, I'm not in a position to put any of the content of that onto the screen or to make it public.
Very well, I think we should leave the sudden death report for later. Now, the other matter. Is that all the matters?
Those were
matters,
all the
okay.
matters.
Right. Also, Ms. Graham, in the post-incident management chapter, will you be addressing the issue of the identification of the body in more detail?
Yes, that will be a matter that can be explored in what we anticipate to be the third hearing regarding post-incident management, and in particular the way that information was relayed to the family at that time will be explored in some detail.
And I suppose that will also extend to the issue of the embassy.
Yes,
ceremony.
that is also a matter.
Yes.
I'm grateful to Ms Mitchell because at a very early stage a number of matters, significant matters, were raised to my attention, and we very much intend to explore those in detail at that later hearing on post-incident management. And you may recall that the way in which the authorities dealt with the family and friends in all manner of aspects is something that we wish to explore in significant detail.
So I think I would prefer to explore these important matters thoroughly and in a later hearing. So I can allow you to ask the question about the batons, but the other matters seem to me to be all for later, to be addressed at a later stage. So if you wish, do you wish to ask the question about the batons?
Yes, indeed, Mark.
But I'm going to rearrange the sitting for that. Detective Inspector, you're going to be asked some questions by Miss Mitchell, counsel for the families.
There's just one issue I want to ask you about, and that's in relation to the point in the at the scene at Hayfield Road where you took control. You've given your evidence to explain that at a point you realised it was more serious and you took over control. And one of the things that you did was to put up barrier tape.
Yes.
And you've given an explanation of why you might want to secure that area. And I think you gave evidence to say that one of the initial things you did was scene management in terms of setting parameters and securing the area, and in terms of any further contamination of the area. Is that correct?
Yeah.
After Sheikh Abayo's body was removed and it was put in the ambulance, did you see police batons lying around?
Not at that stage, no. I was aware that they were already collected by DC Connell.
So, having known that they were collected, did you take any action in relation to them as to what should be done with them?
They were already seized from their original position. We were past that point, so they would be seized as a production. I wouldn't place them back on the ground. That wouldn't be...
No, I wasn't suggesting
Yeah.
that, but if you knew that they had been bagged, were you going to decide to put them somewhere, or...?
They were within my police vehicle, and I subsequently seized them individually in evidence production bags.
Okay, and so you split them up?
Yep.
And tagged them, presumably?
Yes.
And then did what?
They were lodged as a production with the inquiry team.
Detective Inspector, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm going to rise briefly to let the next witness be brought in, and you'll then be free to go.
Thank you, sir.
Now, Miss Graham, who's the next witness?
The next witness is DC Jennifer Bruce.
Good afternoon, Detective Constable. Would you take the oath?
Yes.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole
the
truth,
whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Thank you. You are Jennifer Bruce.
Yes.
What age are you?
37,
How many years service do you have?
14,
And you've been a DC since 2014?
2012.
Oh, sorry, my mistake. Prior to that, you'd been a police constable.
Yes.
And we have all your contact details, so we don't need to look at those.
Yes.
Have you been able to watch any of the other evidence that we've
Yes.
had? Great. You'll know there's a black folder in front of you.
Yes.
Let's look at the two things that should be there. The first should be PS 00772, a statement dated the 5th of May
Yep.
2015. This was an operational statement, was it?
Yeah, it's just a statement I compiled myself.
A statement you prepared on
Yeah.
the 5th of May, 2 days after the events we're here to
That's correct.
explore. And were you doing your best to give a true and accurate record of your involvement with these events in that statement?
Yes.
Thank you. And then can we look at your inquiry statement, please? SBPI 32. This is a statement you've given to the inquiry, taken by a member of the team on the 14th of March 2022. Do you have that in your black folder as well?
Yes, I do.
Great. And can we look at the last paragraph, 35? And we'll see that it says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And am I correct in saying you've signed every page?
Yep.
And that was on the 14th of April this year.
Yes.
Lovely. You have hard copies of those. If you want to refer to any part of them at any time, please feel free to do so. And if it's not on the screen, I'll make sure it gets on the screen. So paragraph 4, first of all, you were part of a major investigation team and you started as a DC in MIT and you were there in May 2015.
Yes.
And then paragraph 7, your team, you say you always worked in Dundee, but your team helped cover the Fife area and sometimes worked weekend cover and occasionally be asked to go to Kirkcaldy.
Yes.
But it wasn't your usual base, Kirkcaldy. You'd
No.
sometimes work there.
I worked in Dundee and we generally covered the north, so we would go Aberdeen, Inverness way.
Right.
But just given how close we were to Fife, if need be, we would come to Fife. But not very often.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
And then paragraphs 14 and 15, you tell us that on the 3rd of May 2015, you started at 8 o'clock in the morning in Dundee. And that was you and a colleague, and you were the only two working in the MIT in Dundee that day. It was a Sunday.
Yeah.
And then paragraph 15, you were asked to go and help in Kirkcaldy, so you then travelled to Kirkcaldy.
That's right.
And what time did you arrive in Kirkcaldy?
I think from my first statement it said we were asked to go about 11 o'clock and then maybe took 40 minutes to get there, so probably just before lunchtime.
So was it a senior officer in Dundee asked you and your colleague to
We had a
travel
sergeant in Dundee who was dealing with another incident, so he asked us to go to Kirkcaldy.
and you went there to help in connection with the Shekubayo incident?
Yes.
And what was your role to be?
Just an inquiry officer, just to assist with any inquiries that were required. Usually it would be noting witness statements.
So you're really an additional resource at Kirkcaldy to help organise and prepare the investigation?
Yeah, generally it would be noting civilian witness statements. I think that was the role that we were tasked with.
And I think you've said in paragraph 17 of your inquiry statement that you did actually take a witness statement at
Yeah.
that time. And can I ask you about your involvement with Inspector Combe, Jane Combe?
Yeah, so later on that day, my colleague that I'd been working with finished duty, so I was left without a double up. And I was asked, being a female, if I would pair up with a female inspector to assist in season clothing.
And can we look at paragraph 18, please? I think you say, Keith, your colleague had to finish on time. So I ended up there on your own. I was paired up with a uniform inspector just to see some clothing. Her name was Inspector Jane Combe. I hadn't worked with her before. I don't remember who asked me to do that.
Yep.
And were you aware of Inspector Combe at that time?
No, I had never met her before.
You'd never previously met her. Can I ask you, did you have any involvement with Conrad Trickett that day, who was the post-incident manager?
I was aware he was there because he'd also come from Tayside, but no, I didn't have any.
No involvement?
No.
Can I look at paragraph 19? You've been asked here about seizing clothing. We seized the clothing of 4 officers, and I wrote up the labels and helped seal up the bags. Seizing the clothing of the officers is to try and preserve the productions forensically. And we've heard some evidence today that forensic seizing, rather than just normal seizing, would involve officers wearing white uniforms?
Yeah, forensic suit.
Suits,
Yeah.
sorry, that's the word. It's Friday afternoon. So did you wear a white forensic suit that day?
Yes, we wore a different one for each officer and then bagged up those suits.
And did Inspector Combe also wear that?
Yes.
And we've already heard that after each item, each officer has been dealt with,
Mm-hmm.
the white suit that you're wearing is then folded up and also
Yeah.
seized
And
at
then we
that
put a
time.
new one on for the next officer.
And what's the reason for that being done?
Just to avoid any cross-contamination for when they're later examined.
So the items you're examining are then sent off to be forensically examined by other scientists and forensic
Yep.
people. And some of the items that you recovered were from Nicole Short,
Yes.
PC Short.
Yes.
But it wasn't just only female officers that you seized items from that day, but she was one of them.
Yeah, I think initially it was all females and then I think there was one male at the end.
All right, thank you. Could we look at paragraph 20, please? It's on the screen. Specifically on that day, as best I can remember, we got the officers to stand on a brown paper bag and take each item of their uniform off. We were in forensic suits as well, with gloves on. As they took each item off, they would hand it to me or the inspector, and we would put it in a production bag, and we would give the production a name by writing on the bag or label. We just did that until we had every item that we needed. Then we bagged up our own forensic suits and gloves. You end up with a pile of everything that they were wearing, everything that we were wearing, all bagged and labelled and sealed for each officer. And then if we look at paragraph 21, different officers wear their equipment differently. We didn't remove or unclip any of it. So for Samantha Davidson, I've written in my statement on page 3, vest with baton, which means it's clipped on or in one of the pockets. But they do have different preferences, let's say.
Yeah.
Right. And can we look at paragraph 23, please? You're asked about your previous statement on page 2. I wrote that this is your self-penned statement. I wrote that we seized PC Cayley Goods clothing between 16:47 and 16:53 hours, and Nicole Short's clothing between 18:08 and 18:12 hours. I don't know why there was a delay between these two officers having their clothing seized. I don't think the delay would have been on our part. We've heard evidence from Inspector Combe that there were a number of officers. Thinking now, can you think of any reason why there was a delay in recovering Nicole Short's clothing?
No, I've no idea. We were based in an office and the officers were either brought up to us or came up to the office, and when they arrived we seized their clothing. But what was happening prior to them coming to us, I have no idea.
So it was other officers organising when the
Yeah.
individual officers would attend with you.
Yeah, it was certainly nothing to do with me.
And you were available, I think you said, from about 11 that day?
I think we were asked in Dundee to go through at 11, so we probably arrived just before lunchtime. But then I noted statements after that.
When were you available that day to forensically recover or preserve productions or items of clothing?
I think I noted a statement at about 1:15. So I don't know how long that took, maybe an hour or two. So potentially from between 3 and 4.
And certainly you seized Kaylee Good's clothing at 4:47.
Yeah.
And we've heard that there was a room within Kirkcaldy Police Office and the officers attended and you were there with Inspector Cole.
Yeah.
And I think she described sort of standing at the door, making sure nobody was coming in to interrupt. Is that correct?
Yeah.
What time did you go home that evening? You say at paragraph 25, I went home after that. So this was after you'd gathered in these items. What time was that?
I don't know what time I finished duty, but we've obviously seized clothes right up to 2 minutes past 8 that evening, so probably just shortly after that I left, and then we'd have to travel back to Dundee to go off duty.
Thank you. Can we look at paragraphs 26 and 27? This relates to Nicole Short. 26, the 4 minutes to seize Nicole Short's clothing was the time for her to take them off and for us to put them in the bags. I don't think I would have spent much longer with her before or after that. She would have had to get redressed into something afterwards, but that would be about it. Do you remember what she was wearing when she arrived? You've said at paragraph 27, she came to us, she had her t-shirt, microfleece and her vest.
They all arrived to us in uniform, but whether they were carrying some of it or wearing some of it, I don't know if they had their vests on or not, but the rest of it they were wearing their uniform.
I was going to ask you, was Nicole Short wearing her body armour and her high visibility vest or carrying it?
I don't remember.
Thank you. When you talk about her microfleece and her vest, what do you mean by that?
So by her vest, it's her stab-proof vest.
The black body armour
Yeah, the
type
body
thing
armour.
that we've seen?
Yeah, and the microfleece is just a thin, fleecy top that you wear underneath your stab-proof vest.
Is that standard police issue or something?
Yeah, you get issued them. They've got police on the arm, a small zip and just thin fleece material.
Right. Could I ask you to look at a vest, please? It's in a bag. Miss Wildgoose will hand this to you. And I'm going to ask you if you recognise it.
Yeah, that's my writing on the label.
So, and is that Nicole Short's vest?
Yes, it's called Nicole Shorts.
Thank you. And that was the item that you seized from her that day?
Yeah.
And do you remember anything unusual about it at the time?
No.
Was anything drawn to your attention?
No.
Didn't PC Short indicate to you in any way that there was a mark or something on it that was significant or important?
No.
Would you look at this photograph, please, that we've got on the screen, second one, and you'll see this is a photograph of the rear of Nicole Short's vest, and you'll see that there's a dark coloured mark on the back of the yellow high-vis jacket part.
Yep.
Was that drawn to your attention at all on the day that you recovered it?
No.
If it had been drawn to your attention, what would you have done to respond to that?
We would have raised that with a senior investigating officer and let them decide how they wanted to proceed with that.
Who was the senior investigating officer?
DCI Stuart Houston, I think.
Right. And was he someone that you could have gone to and spoken to about a mark on a vest if that had been drawn to your attention?
If not him, somebody just below him, yeah.
But ideally the senior investigating officer?
Yeah, or the deputy.
The deputy?
Yeah.
Whoever that may have been?
Yeah.
Right. And Was there any sort of mechanism or procedure in place where you would have drawn that to the attention of the forensic services in any way? Would you have
No, I would say
marked
that's
it on the
probably-
label? Or
No. I
No.
would say it's probably more a decision for the SIO to make how they wanted to proceed with that, whether they wanted it photographed or taken straight to the lab, or that would be a decision for them.
So if you've noticed something on an item or it's drawn to your attention,
Yep.
you can draw that to the attention of the SIO. And is there any reason you can think of why, if someone has brought something to your attention or you've noticed something, that you wouldn't mention that to the SIO?
Not if it was flagged up as potentially being relevant.
Right. So no reason that you would, if that mark had been drawn to your attention, you can't think of any reason why you wouldn't have mentioned that to the SIO that day?
No.
Can I ask you about paragraphs 29 and 30 of your inquiry statement, please? It says, I don't remember if Nicole Short said anything to me about her uniform when she came to us. I didn't have much of a conversation with any of them. I don't think any of them said very much at all, but I can't specifically remember. I didn't consider photographing any of the clothing. This is not something I would normally do. It's not routinely done. I'm quite interested in taking the photographs.
Okay.
What's the normal routine with photographs?
We wouldn't normally photograph items of clothes that we've seized. We would package them, send them for examination, and it would be for the scientists, if they find something during examination, to decide to take a photo.
So more the forensic specialists could
Also,
take photographs?
We are not examining them, so it's more during the examination that if anything is found, it would be photographed.
Right, thank you. So that wasn't part of what you were doing, the process you were following wasn't any part of it?
No, we weren't to examine them, we were just to seize them and bag them.
Thank you. If an officer had asked about a photograph or wished a photograph taken, is that something that you would also have spoken to the SIO about?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we look at paragraph 32? When I was seizing the officer's clothing, it was clear to all parties that bagging and labelling the uniform was our only role at that time. There was a mutual understanding that we would not ask the officers any questions and they would not discuss the incident with us. Our role that day was purely to seize their clothing, not to obtain any information from them. And is that you weren't having discussions with them or noting down what had happened earlier that day or any of that?
No, there was no conversation.
Do you have any recollection now about how Nicole Short was when you seized her clothing?
Not specifically Nicole. I remember all the officers seemed upset, but not specifically anything about Nicole.
All right, thank you. Can we look at paragraph 33, please? You're asked about the media. I've not really been following the media surrounding this case. I see the headlines occasionally, or if it's on STV News at night, I don't go out of my way to follow it. I haven't really seen much more other than that, maybe a headline on the news about his family. I really haven't followed it much at all. The family were making a complaint about how it was dealt with. That's all I know really. I've maybe seen a family member or their solicitor making comment about complaints that they've made and the processes they're going through. I've not seen anything out with that about the incident itself. So you've not really followed this?
No, I mean, other than that, the day of the incident that I attended, I then went back to Dundee and had nothing at all to do with the inquiry thereafter.
So you've not had any ongoing contact really with the officers who were involved?
I didn't know any of them. I've had no contact with them since, and yeah, because it was a Sunday, I helped that day and then had nothing else to do with it.
So you had an awareness that the family were concerned
Yep.
about certain aspects, but no more than that really?
No.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Any Rule 9 applications? No. Detective Constable, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm about to rise for the day, and then you'll be free to go.
Thank you.